My fingers trembled as I stared at the community newsletter, not from my stroke 6 weeks earlier, but from shock. Community redevelopment plan approved, the headline declared, with Mayor Wilson shaking hands with developers in front of our community center. The center where I'd volunteered for 42 years. The center they'd now voted to demolish while I was in the hospital. My stomach clenched as the realization hit me. They'd waited until I couldn't speak up. My name is Catherine Hayes. I'm 72 years old, and this is the story of how they tried to erase 4 decades of community history during 6 weeks of my medical recovery. What they didn't know was just how deeply I understood the place they were so eager to tear down. If this situation resonates with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. The kitchen chair creaked as I slumped into it. My left arm still felt heavier than my right, a reminder of the stroke that had sent me to the hospital on April 3rd. The date burned in my memory because it was also the day before the first emergency planning session that Mayor Wilson had apparently called about the community center's future. The timing was no coincidence. "Kate, I let myself in. Brought those books you wanted." Zoe Chen, a community organizer half my age, had been checking on me since my hospital release. She saw the newsletter and froze. "Oh no, you saw it. You knew?" My teacher's voice emerged, the tone that had quieted classrooms for 37 years. Zoe pulled out the chair across from me. "I found out yesterday. I was trying to figure out how to tell you." She hesitated. "They've been holding meetings for weeks. Always with minimal notice, always when most community members couldn't attend. Like when the person who's run volunteer programs there for 4 decades is recovering from a stroke." The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. Exactly like that. Zoe reached for my hand across the table. "But Kate, the demolition permits have already been filed. They're scheduled to start in 30 days. The room tilted slightly. 30 days. The number hit me physically, like a second stroke. In 30 days, they planned to demolish the building where I'd organized after-school programs that served 8,427 children since 1992, where we'd sheltered 43 families during the flood of, where I'd spent more waking hours than in my own home since my husband passed away 9 years ago. Let me see everything they've published about this." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "And I need my files from the center." Zoe raised her eyebrows. "Files? I've kept records of every meeting, every agreement, every promise the city has made about that center since 1981. I straightened my spine, feeling my classroom posture returning. Mayor Wilson seems to have forgotten that before he was mayor, he was my student and before he was my student, I was a very good secretary. Over the next 3 days, Zoe helped me retrieve 14 storage boxes from my garage and the community center storage room. Each was meticulously labeled by year, containing folders organized by topic. While my body moved slower than before, my mind raced through decades of documentation. "Here," I said, pulling out a thick binder from 1997, the Historic Preservation Agreement. The city accepted federal grant money to renovate the center in '97, with the condition that the original structure be preserved for a minimum of 50. Zoe's eyes widened as she scanned the document. "This is legally binding. How could they not know about this?" "Oh, someone knows." I pointed to the signature line at the bottom. "That's Richard Wilson, Mayor Thomas Wilson's father. He was on the council then." The minutes from the emergency planning sessions revealed the truth clearly. 6 meetings in 6 weeks, all scheduled during weekday mornings when working community members couldn't attend. Approvals rushed through with minimal public comment, and most telling, the complete absence of any mention of my concerns or objections, because I hadn't been there to raise any. The next day, I attended my first community meeting since the stroke. I wore my blue blazer, the one I'd always worn on the first day of school to establish authority. My hand gripped my walker more for reassurance than necessity as I entered the community center's meeting room. The conversation stopped as I entered. Mayor Wilson recovered first, his professional smile clicking into place. "Catherine, wonderful to see you up and about. We've all been so concerned." "Thank you, Thomas. I've been reviewing the minutes from the meetings I missed. Quite an efficient process you've managed in my absence." Several council members suddenly found their papers fascinating. "Well, progress waits for no one." His laugh rang false. "We've got exciting changes coming to Millfield." "So I've read." I settled into a chair in the front row, placing my folder of documents on my lap. "I'm particularly interested in how the plans address the 1997 Historic Preservation Agreement." The tightening around his eyes told me everything. He didn't know about it, or had hoped no one else did. For the next hour, I watched beautiful renderings of glass and steel structures that bore no resemblance to our community center. When I raised my hand, Mayor Wilson consistently overlooked it until Councilwoman Mercer reluctantly acknowledged me. "I'm curious about the community input process," I said evenly. "The minutes indicate broad community support, yet I count only 7 non-officials attending these meetings. In a neighborhood of 12,000 residents." Mayor Wilson stepped forward. "Catherine, these technical planning discussions can be quite complex. We've condensed the relevant information for general public consumption." "Interesting approach," I replied, "since the city charter specifically requires minimum 30-day notice for any historic building modification discussions, not the 48 hours given for these meetings." The room fell silent. Mayor Wilson's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. "We appreciate your years of service, Catherine, but these development matters require a forward-looking perspective." He glanced at his watch. "Due to time constraints, we'll move to the next agenda item." Just like that, I was dismissed. Erased. 42 years of community knowledge rendered irrelevant with a glance at a watch. As I left the meeting, my hands trembled again, not from weakness, but from a cold, clarifying anger. They thought I was just a sweet old lady with a walker. They thought 6 weeks was enough time to erase 4 decades. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The morning after the meeting, I woke before dawn, my mind racing. I made my way to the kitchen table, where I'd spread the meeting minutes from all 6 emergency planning sessions. Setting my tea down, I began marking each document with a red pen, circling dates, noting inconsistencies, and marking procedural violations. "We built this center together," I whispered, remembering the community fundraising drive in 1981 that transformed an abandoned municipal building into our neighborhood hub. Back then, Mayor Wilson had been 7 years old, helping his father, then Councilman Wilson, hammer in nails during the renovation weekends. Now I wondered if he remembered any of it, or if he'd conveniently forgotten that the land had been deeded for community use in perpetuity by the Millfield family. The doorbell rang at 9:17. Zoe stood on my porch with Marcus Rivera beside her. At 24, Marcus had grown from the shy 10-year-old who'd found sanctuary in our after-school program into a community college student with quick fingers on his phone's keyboard. "Ms. Hayes," Zoe said, "you might need help." Marcus shifted awkwardly, his respect making me feel simultaneously appreciated and ancient. "I remember when you were too short to reach the basketball hoop at the center," I said, letting them in. "Now look at you. And yes, I need all the help I can get." Over coffee, I showed them what I'd found in the meeting minutes. 6 meetings in 6 weeks, all during my hospitalization and recovery. Not coincidence. Strategy. I tapped the papers. Notice how each meeting built on the previous one, with no time for community response. By the 3rd meeting, they were referring to demolition as already approved in principle, though no formal vote had occurred. Marcus frowned. "That's messed up. My mom still takes my little sisters to the center for homework help. Where are they supposed to go?" According to this, Zoe said, pointing to a glossy brochure, there will be community amenities in the new development. But look at the fine print, at market rate rents, which means none of our current programs could afford to continue. My chest tightened as I spoke. This isn't just about a building. It's about erasing services that 3 generations of Millfield families have relied on. Marcus scrolled through his phone. They're already promoting this online. Millfield Renaissance, a bold new vision. They're making it sound like they're saving the neighborhood instead of tearing out its heart. I reached for one of my older file boxes, labeled 1985-1990. When Thomas Wilson was first elected to City Council 12 years ago, he campaigned on community preservation. His first speech was at our center. I pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping with a photo of a younger Thomas Wilson, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling. The headline read, "Wilson pledges to protect Millfield's character." "What happened to him?" Zoe asked. "Ambition," I answered simply. Last year, he formed an exploratory committee for state senate. Development projects photograph well in campaign materials. Community preservation doesn't. We spent the next 3 hours organizing my documentation chronologically. A disturbing pattern emerged with each file we reviewed. Mayor Wilson had begun sidelining me from committee appointments about 18 months ago. Meetings had gradually been rescheduled to times when I had standing commitments. My input had been increasingly minimized in official minutes. "He's been planning this for over a year," Zoe realized, eyes widening. "Your stroke just gave him the perfect opportunity to accelerate the timeline, while removing the person most likely to recognize what was happening. The betrayal felt physical, like a pain in my chest. Thomas had been my student. I'd written his first college recommendation letter. I'd campaigned for him in his first council race." Marcus photographed key documents with his phone. "Ms. Hayes, would you be okay if I shared some of this online? People need to see what's happening." I hesitated only briefly. Yes. Knowledge is our only leverage now. Later that afternoon, we visited the community center. I wanted to feel the space again, to remind myself what we were fighting for. My walker made soft squeaking sounds against the worn linoleum floors I'd helped refinish 3 times over 4 decades. The center hummed with afternoon activity. Seniors played cards in one corner, while elementary students worked on homework in another. The computer lab bustled with teenagers and adults. A young mother rocked her baby while her toddler played with blocks nearby. I ran my hand along the wall, feeling the slight imperfection where water damage from the '87 flood had been repaired. My fingertips knew every inch of this building. Each scratch told a story of community history. Mrs. Abernathy, 85, looked up from her card game and waved. "Catherine, good to see you back. Heard they're planning to tear this place down. Not if I can help it." Gladys. "That Wilson boy never did listen properly," she snorted. "Even when you had him in your class." The center's director, James Harmon, approached with obvious discomfort. He'd been appointed 3 years ago, after my dear friend Mabel retired, and had gradually shifted from community advocate to administrative yes-man. "Catherine, good to see you recovering." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I've been meaning to call you." "Have you, James? That's interesting. Since my phone works perfectly well, perhaps you were too busy attending planning meetings about demolishing this building." He flinched. "It's not that simple. The building needs $1.2 million in repairs to meet current codes. The city doesn't have that money. The building needed $1.2 million in repairs 3 years ago too, when I authored the grant proposal that would have covered it. The proposal you never submitted." His eyes darted away. There were concerns about the matching requirements. From whom exactly? I let the question hang there. We both knew the answer. James excused himself quickly, and I turned to Zoe and Marcus. Another pattern. Every effort to secure funding for renovations has been systematically blocked for the past 3 years. They've manufactured this crisis. As we left the building, I paused at the entrance, looking up at the simple brick facade with Millfield Community Center carved above the doorway. My mind flashed to the dedication ceremony in 1981, the cheers of neighbors who had pooled their limited resources to create this place. They think they can erase all of this, I said quietly. 42 years of community, thousands of lives changed, dozens of crises weathered together. Zoe squeezed my arm gently. They underestimate who they're dealing with. Yes, I nodded, straightening my shoulders. They certainly did. But what I didn't say aloud was the question keeping me awake at night. How do you fight City Hall when they've already signed the demolition permits? The days following our visit to the community center passed in a blur of documentation and discovery. Every morning, Zoe and Marcus would arrive at my home by 8:30, and we'd work through another layer of files and records. What had begun as an effort to save a building had evolved into something more profound, uncovering a deliberate pattern to erase community voice and memory. On Friday morning, 10 days after I'd first seen the newsletter announcement, we gathered around my dining table for what had become our war council. The table was covered with color-coded files, each representing a different aspect of our investigation. Let's review what we know, I said, tapping the red folder. Mayor Wilson accelerated the redevelopment approval process during my medical absence. His brother's company stands to make significant profit from the project, and at least 3 procedural violations occurred during the approval process. 4 violations, Zoe corrected, pointing to her notes. They also failed to conduct the required environmental impact assessment for historical properties. Marcus looked up from his laptop. My post about the demolition plans got shared 600-400 times overnight. People are angry, but the mayor's office released a statement saying it's misinformation and that the community process was thorough and inclusive. I snorted. 7 people at a meeting announced 48 hours in advance is neither thorough nor inclusive. There's a council meeting this afternoon, Zoe said. Public comments are on the agenda. It's our first chance to raise these issues formally. My stomach tightened. While I'd been making steady physical progress, the thought of speaking publicly, potentially being dismissed again, sent a wave of anxiety through me. What if my words slurred under pressure? What if my left arm started trembling visibly? I'll go, I said finally, but we need more than just accusations. We need irrefutable evidence. Marcus grinned suddenly. Miss Hayes, check your email. I think we just got exactly that. I opened my laptop, a birthday gift from my children that I'd finally mastered during the pandemic. An email from Layla, the center's receptionist, contained a single attachment, a scanned memo on Mayor Wilson's official letterhead dated March 15th, just 3 weeks before my stroke. Regarding Millfield redevelopment timeline, I read aloud. My voice faltered as I continued. Target council approval during April-May window when primary opposition Kay Hayes will be focused on grant applications and spring programming. Zoe and Marcus leaned over my shoulders, reading in stunned silence. He was planning to push this through while you were busy, Zoe said quietly. Then your stroke made it even easier. My hands were steady as I placed the printed memo in a new folder. He didn't count on my having allies who could see what I couldn't. At 2045 that afternoon, we arrived at City Hall for the 300 council meeting. I dressed carefully in my navy suit, the one I'd worn to testify before the school board and city council numerous times over the decades. Zoe walked beside me, carrying our documentation in a professional portfolio. Marcus followed, phone already recording. The council chambers were more crowded than I'd expected. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood, and familiar faces turned as I entered. Mrs. Abernathy from the card group, parents from the after-school program, former students now grown with children of their own. Mayor Wilson's expression flickered briefly when he saw me, surprise quickly masked by his political smile. "Quite a turnout today," he murmured to Councilwoman Mercer, who shifted uncomfortably. I took a seat in the front row, directly in Mayor Wilson's line of sight. The meeting began with administrative matters, permits, and budget approvals. I noticed the redevelopment wasn't on the formal agenda, just the public comment period where we could raise it. When Mayor Wilson finally opened the floor for public comments, he added a restriction. Due to the number of speakers today, comments will be limited to 2 minutes each. Several community members spoke first, raising concerns about the center's demolition. Each time, Mayor Wilson thanked them politely before noting that the redevelopment plan has already undergone thorough review and received council approval. When he called my name, I rose slowly, leaving my walker by my chair. The short walk to the podium seemed longer than ever, but I moved deliberately, head high. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "My name is Catherine Hayes. For those who don't know me, I've coordinated volunteer programs at Millfield Community Center for 4. I've also taught many of you or your children during my 37 years as an elementary school teacher in this community." I paused, looking directly at Mayor Wilson, including you, Thomas. A murmur ran through the audience. Mayor Wilson's smile tightened. "I recently suffered a minor stroke that kept me hospitalized and recovering for 6 weeks. Coincidentally, those exact 6 weeks were when 6 separate meetings were held to approve the demolition of our community center, a building protected by the Historic Preservation Agreement of 1997, which I have here." I held up the document, a legally binding agreement with federal oversight that prohibits demolition for 50 years from signing. The council members exchanged glances. Councilwoman Mercer leaned over to whisper something to Mayor Wilson, whose face had hardened. "Ms. Hayes, while we appreciate your service," he began. "I'm not finished, Thomas. My 2 minutes aren't up." I hadn't used my teacher's voice in years, but it worked just as effectively as it had in the classroom. He fell silent. "I also have here," I continued, "a memo from your office dated March 15th, specifically identifying me as primary opposition to be circumvented by timing approvals while I was occupied elsewhere. I have meeting minutes showing procedural violations. I have evidence that Wilson Development Corporation, owned by your brother, stands to profit directly from this project." The chamber went completely silent. Even the usual shuffling and whispering had ceased. "Ms. Hayes, your time is up," Mayor Wilson said, his voice tight. "Actually, Mayor Wilson, if I may," came a deep voice from the back. Robert Carmichael, retired judge and longtime resident, stood up. "As a former municipal court judge, I'd like to request council response to the procedural violations Ms. Hayes has identified, which, if verified, would invalidate the approval process entirely." Mayor Wilson's face had gone pale. "This isn't the appropriate forum." "It's exactly the appropriate forum," Judge Carmichael interrupted. "This is a public meeting of elected officials who appear to have violated city charter requirements for transparency." Councilwoman Mercer cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should review the documentation Ms. Hayes has presented before proceeding further with the redevelopment plans." Mayor Wilson shot her a look of pure frustration before regaining his composure. "We'll take these concerns under advisement and review the relevant documentation. Next speaker, please." As I returned to my seat, legs trembling slightly from both physical exertion and adrenaline, the crowd broke into spontaneous applause. The sound washed over me, not just support, but recognition. After weeks of being dismissed and overlooked, I was finally being seen and heard. Outside City Hall afterward, a small crowd of community members gathered. Marcus organized them into a group photo, phone held high. "For social media," he explained. "We need to show this isn't just one person's fight." As I looked at the diverse group, seniors I'd known for decades, young families, teenagers who'd grown up in our programs, something shifted inside me. This wasn't just about preserving a building or exposing procedural violations. It was about recognizing that community memory and relationships were themselves a form of power. They tried to erase us, I said quietly to Zoe, but they forgot that community leaves permanent marks. The press conference, the following morning, exceeded all our expectations. What Zoe had envisioned as a small gathering with local reporters transformed into something far more significant. By 9:45 a.m., the community center's main hall was filled with over 100 residents, 3 television news crews, and reporters from both local and regional papers. "There are so many people," I whispered to Zoe as we prepared near the small podium we'd set up. Despite my decades of addressing classrooms and community meetings, the size of the crowd sent a flutter of anxiety through me. "They're here for you, Kate," Zoe said, squeezing my hand, "and for themselves. This is what community looks like." Marcus approached, practically vibrating with excitement. "Ms. Hayes, check this out." He showed me his phone, displaying the local news website's homepage. The headline read, "Historic Preservation Agreement May Block Controversial Millfield Development." "That was fast," I murmured, adjusting my blazer and straightening my shoulders. At precisely 10,000 a.m., Zoe stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for coming today. We're here because the heart of Millfield, this community center, is under threat, not just from demolition, but from a process that deliberately excluded the very people who built it, maintained it, and depend on it daily." She introduced me with a warmth that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "Catherine Hayes has given 42 years of her life to this center and this community." When officials tried to use her stroke recovery to push through demolition plans, they underestimated what 4 decades of meticulous documentation looks like. As I approached the microphone, the room erupted in applause. I looked out at faces I'd known for years, some for decades, and found my voice. "I taught elementary school for 37 years, I began. "One of the first lessons we teach children is the importance of playing fair and following rules. It appears some of our officials need a refresher course." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, easing my nerves. "Yesterday at the city council meeting, I presented evidence of procedural violations in the redevelopment approval process. Today, I want to share what's at stake beyond the procedural issues." For the next 15 minutes, I outlined the community center's history and significance with precise figures. The 8,427 children served by after-school programs since 1992. The 43 families sheltered during the flood of '87, the 28 seniors currently participating in weekly activities. "This isn't just a building," I said, my voice growing stronger. "It's 42 years of community history. It's 3 generations of Millfield families who found support, connection, and opportunity within these walls." I then introduced our community coalition, a diverse group spanning ages 16 to 85, who would be leading different aspects of our response. Judge Carmichael would handle legal questions about the Historic Preservation Agreement. Zoe would coordinate community organizing. Marcus would manage digital communications and social media. And I concluded, will be doing what I've done for 42 years, making sure our community's history isn't erased and its future isn't decided without its voice being heard. As questions from reporters began, I noticed a familiar figure slipping into the back of the room. Mayor Wilson stood with arms crossed, his expression unreadable as he observed the proceedings. "Miss Hayes," called a reporter from the regional paper. The mayor's office issued a statement this morning saying the preservation agreement has been reviewed by city attorneys and doesn't prevent redevelopment. Your response? Before I could answer, Judge Carmichael stepped forward. "I've had the opportunity to review the 1997 agreement in detail. It explicitly prohibits demolition or substantial structural modification for 50 years without federal review and approval. neither of which has occurred. Any city attorney claiming otherwise is either misinformed or deliberately misleading the public. Another reporter raised her hand. The mayor also stated that the community center needs over $1 million in repairs that the city can't afford. Isn't redevelopment the only financially viable option? This time, Zoe responded. We've obtained copies of 3 separate grant proposals for renovation funding that were prepared over the past 3 years, all of which were blocked from submission at the administrative level. The funding options exist. What's been lacking is the political will to pursue them. Throughout the exchanges, I watched Mayor Wilson's face. The confident politician I'd seen in council chambers was giving way to something else, the gradual recognition that he'd miscalculated. When the formal press conference ended, he slipped out before reporters could approach him. As community members gathered in smaller groups afterward, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Councilwoman Diana Mercer stood behind me, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Catherine, can we speak privately?" We moved to the small office I'd used for decades. Diana closed the door behind us, then spoke in a low voice. I didn't know about the preservation agreement, or about Thomas's brother's company being involved. She looked genuinely distressed. "I thought we were doing what was necessary, because of the building's condition. Did you also not know about the blocked grant applications?" I kept my voice neutral. She winced. "I knew about one. Thomas said it had requirements the city couldn't meet." "And you didn't verify that yourself? You used to be more thorough, Diana. I remember when you organized the playground fundraiser in 2008, you checked every detail personally." That was different. I was younger, less politically invested. I leaned forward slightly. What happened to the Diana who fought for 6 months to get proper crossing guards near the elementary school? She looked away. Politics changes you. Gradually, you make small compromises to get things done, then larger ones. Well, this particular compromise involves destroying a community landmark that's legally protected while benefiting the mayor's brother financially. That's quite a compromise, Diana. Her face flushed. "I didn't know about his brother. I swear, Catherine, I studied her, remembering the earnest young woman who'd volunteered countless hours at the center."
Then prove it.
"Help us ensure a fair process moving forward." After she left, Zoe found me still sitting in the office, processing the conversation. "Everything okay?" she asked. "I think we just gained an insider, though she doesn't realize it yet." I smiled slightly. Diana always did need time to find her courage. By late afternoon, Marcus approached with his laptop. "Miss Hayes, you need to see this." The mayor just called an emergency press conference for 5:00 p.m. at City Hall. The 3 of us watched the live stream together. Mayor Wilson, looking considerably less confident than usual, announced a temporary pause in the redevelopment process to review certain historical agreements that have been brought to our attention. "He's buying time," Judge Carmichael commented, having joined us to watch. "But he's also acknowledging there's an issue he can't simply dismiss." "What's our next move?" Marcus asked. I smiled, feeling a second wind despite my fatigue. "We keep building momentum. Thomas thinks he can wait us out. Let the attention die down. Let's prove him wrong." "How?" Zoe asked. "By showing him that 5 years in business school doesn't compare to 4 decades of community organizing." I pulled a notebook from my purse. "I've been planning community engagement campaigns since before any of you were born. Let me show you how it's done." The 2 weeks following our press conference transformed Millfield Community Center into a headquarters buzzing with activity. Our coalition implemented what Marcus dubbed Operation Remember, with Judge Carmichael leading legal investigations while we built public support. Each day, we released a Millfield memory on social media, photographs, documents, and testimonials chronicling the center's impact over 4 decades. By the start of the 3rd week, Mayor Wilson could no longer maintain his silence. His office announced a special town hall meeting to discuss community concerns regarding the Millfield redevelopment initiative. "He's trying to regain control of the narrative," Zoe observed, as we prepared our response. "But he's playing catch-up." The night before the town hall, our core team gathered at my home. My dining room had transformed into a war room, with strategy documents covering every surface. My stroke recovery had continued steadily, and my mind felt sharper than it had in years, energized by purpose and righteous indignation. "Tomorrow is crucial," I told the group of 12 spread throughout my living and dining rooms. "Mayor Wilson will attempt to reframe this as a reasonable misunderstanding, present modified plans, and hope for a compromise that still allows the demolition to proceed." Judge Carmichael nodded. Classic damage control. He'll offer concessions that seem significant but preserve his core objective. I smiled. Something Thomas has forgotten about me. Before I was a community organizer, I was a teacher, and teachers know how to control a classroom. The town hall was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. at the high school auditorium. By 6:15, when our team arrived, the 500-seat space was already half full. By 6:45, it was standing room only, with people lining the walls and spilling into the hallway outside. Mayor Wilson and the council members entered precisely at 7:00, their faces registering surprise at the turnout. I sat in the front row, directly in the mayor's line of sight, flanked by Judge Carmichael and Zoe. Marcus positioned himself near the center aisle with his camera equipment. After brief introductions, Mayor Wilson took the podium, his professional smile firmly in place. "Thank you all for coming tonight. It's wonderful to see such engagement in our community's future." He launched into a prepared presentation, showing glossy renders of the proposed development. While we understand the sentimental attachment many have to the current community center, we must acknowledge that the building requires over $1.2 million in repairs and updates to meet current. The mayor continued smoothly. "However, in light of recent concerns, we've worked with our development partners to create a revised plan that preserves elements of the original structure while providing modern facilities." The screen showed a new rendering, one that incorporated the community center's facade into a much larger glass and steel complex. "Additionally," he continued, "we've negotiated dedicated community spaces at reduced rental rates to ensure continuity of programs during and after construction." When he finally opened the floor for questions, my hand was the first to rise. "Catherine," he acknowledged, his smile tightening slightly. "Always good to hear from our most dedicated community advocate." I stood, taking a moment to make eye contact with various community members before addressing the mayor. "Thomas, thank you for this presentation. I have several questions, but I'll start with the most fundamental one. Can you explain why the city has repeatedly blocked grant applications for the very repairs you're citing as justification for demolition?" His smile faltered. "I'm not aware of any blocked applications. There have been funding challenges." "I have copies of 3 separate grant proposals," I interrupted, holding up a folder, complete with documentation showing they were halted at the administrative level, despite being fully qualified. I've provided copies to each council member and the press. I could see Councilwoman Mercer shifting uncomfortably in her seat as reporters flipped through the packets we'd distributed before the meeting. Mayor Wilson recovered quickly. These proposals would have required matching funds the city couldn't commit to at the time. "That brings me to my second question," I continued. "Can you address the potential conflict of interest regarding Wilson Development Corporation's involvement in this project, specifically your brother's company standing to make approximately $3.4 million in development fees according to the proposal on page 1? A murmur ran through the audience. The mayor's face flushed. "My brother's company was selected through a competitive bidding process, a process that occurred primarily during my hospitalization and early stroke recovery," I noted. with minimal public notice and without the required 30-day comment period stipulated in Municipal Code Section 4. Judge Carmichael rose beside me. If I may follow up, Mayor Wilson, the 1997 Historic Preservation Agreement explicitly prohibits structural modification without federal review. Has such review been conducted? Our legal team has determined that agreement doesn't apply to the current circumstances, Mayor Wilson replied, his voice taking on an edge. Judge Carmichael smiled slightly. That's interesting, because I've consulted with the State Historic Preservation Office, and they've issued this preliminary opinion. He held up an official document. I've included copies in the information packets. They explicitly state that the agreement remains in full force and that the proposed demolition would constitute a clear violation of federal grant requirements. As planned, community members throughout the auditorium began raising their hands in sequence. Each person asked a specific, well-researched question addressing different procedural violations, displacement impacts, or conflicts of interest. Every question was preceded by a personal story about the community center's importance. Seniors who depended on its programs, parents whose children found mentorship there, young adults who discovered their passions through its activities. Mayor Wilson's confident demeanor gradually deteriorated. 40 minutes in, he attempted to regain control. While these are all valuable perspectives, he said, we need to be realistic about the financial constraints and modern needs of our community. That was the cue for our most powerful moment. Zoe stood and addressed the audience. If you or your family has benefited from programs at the Millfield Community Center over the past 42 years, please stand. Nearly everyone in the auditorium rose. Young parents with children, elderly residents needing assistance to stand, teenagers, business owners. The visual impact was undeniable, a living testament to the center's cross-generational importance. In the silence that followed, I stood to deliver our closing statement. Mayor Wilson, members of the council, we aren't opposed to progress or improvements. What we oppose is the erasure of community history and voice. I gestured to the standing crowd. This is the community you were elected to serve, not developers, not political ambitions. These people, I pulled out our final document. We've prepared an alternative proposal. It includes renovation plans using the grant funding that was previously blocked, enhanced by additional community fundraising that's already secured $270. It maintains all current programs while updating facilities to meet code requirements. I handed copies to each council member. We're asking for the law to be followed, for conflicts of interest to be addressed, and for community voice to be genuinely included in decisions about our future. The silence in the room was profound. Mayor Wilson looked genuinely stunned by both the overwhelming community presence and the comprehensive alternative we'd presented. Councilwoman Mercer broke the silence. I move that we table the current redevelopment proposal and form a community advisory committee to review the alternative plan presented tonight. Another council member quickly seconded the motion. Mayor Wilson, clearly recognizing he was outnumbered, attempted to save face. I think that's a reasonable approach. We've always been committed to community input. The vote was unanimous, though the mayor's affirmative response came through a tightly clenched jaw. As the meeting adjourned, community members surrounded us with congratulations. Through it all, I watched Mayor Wilson conferring intensely with his advisors in the corner, his political calculation visibly shifting. 3 months after the town hall meeting, I stood in the community center's garden, watching volunteers plant new flowers along the recently repaired pathway. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds, highlighting both the weathered bricks of the original building and the fresh paint on the refurbished entrance. The tulips should bloom just in time for the 45th anniversary celebration, said Mrs. Abernathy, directing a group of teenagers on proper planting depth. At 85, She had appointed herself garden restoration coordinator with an enthusiasm that put volunteers half her age to shame. The past 3 months had transformed more than just the building. They had transformed our entire neighborhood's understanding of itself. The Community Advisory Committee, officially established after the town hall, had evolved beyond the question of the building's fate to address broader neighborhood needs. I heard familiar footsteps and turned to see Zoe approaching, clipboard in hand. "The contractors just confirmed they'll finish the roof repairs by next Friday," she reported, "and the accessibility upgrades to the east entrance are ahead of schedule. And the grant paperwork? Submitted yesterday, with the mayor's signature." Zoe's smile held satisfaction. He didn't look thrilled, but Diana made sure he understood it was non-negotiable. The changes in Mayor Wilson had been subtle but significant. While he'd never explicitly admitted wrongdoing, his approach had shifted from opposition to grudging cooperation. The pending ethics investigation into his brother's company's involvement had suddenly resolved when Wilson Development Corporation withdrew from the project entirely. We walked through the building, where renovation work continued in careful phases to allow programs to operate with minimal disruption. In the main hall, Marcus was directing a small team setting up for documentary interviews. "Miss Hayes," he called when he spotted us. "We're ready for you whenever you're available. We're capturing before and after footage, plus community memories for the archive." The Millfield Memory Project had evolved from our initial social media campaign into a comprehensive digital and physical archive, documenting not just the community center's history, but the broader neighborhood story. Under Marcus's leadership, students were conducting video interviews, digitizing historical documents, and creating an interactive timeline for the center's lobby. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I promised. I have a meeting first." That meeting waited in my office, no longer the small corner space I'd occupied for decades, but a proper room with my name on the door. Catherine Hayes, Community History Director. The position was new, created as part of the center's restructured leadership model, and funded for the first 3 years by local business donations. Inside, Judge Carmichael was reviewing documents with Diana Mercer, now the council's designated liaison to the advisory committee. "Catherine," Diana greeted me, standing to offer a quick hug. Our relationship had undergone its own renovation, moving from tension back toward the mentorship we'd once shared. "I've brought the final version of the Community Protection Ordinance for your review before next week's council vote." The ordinance represented perhaps our most significant victory: new regulations requiring comprehensive community consultation for any development affecting historic properties or community services, with specific protections against the procedural shortcuts Mayor Wilson had attempted. After my interview with Marcus later that afternoon, I paused in the main hallway where framed photographs chronicled the center's history. A new addition had recently been installed, a large group photo from the town hall meeting, showing hundreds of community members standing together. Beside it hung a smaller frame containing the now famous memo from Mayor Wilson's office, the one identifying me as primary opposition to be circumvented. Beneath it, a simple caption read, "A reminder that community history cannot be erased." As I ran my fingers lightly over the frame, I heard footsteps approaching. To my surprise, it was Mayor Wilson himself, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the building he'd once planned to demolish. "Catherine," he nodded, "just dropping off some paperwork for the state funding match." "Thank you, Thomas," I replied, genuinely appreciative of his cooperation, however reluctantly given. His eyes moved to the framed memo, and he winced slightly. "Not my finest moment." "Perhaps not," I agreed. "But it led to one of our community's finest." He studied me. "You know, you could have pursued that ethics investigation further. Made things very difficult for me politically. That wasn't the goal. The goal was saving this place and ensuring community voice in its future." I gestured toward the building around us. "We achieved that." As he left, I turned once more to the wall of photographs, the visual evidence of a community that had refused erasure. Among them now hung a new image, a snapshot Marcus had taken just a week ago, showing me surrounded by the teenage documentarians of the Memory Project, all of us laughing as they taught me to use their sophisticated camera equipment. The image captured perfectly what these months had taught me, that true legacy isn't about buildings or programs or even personal recognition. It's about creating connections across generations that ensure community wisdom flows in both directions, honoring the past while embracing the future. As I headed home in the fading evening light, I realized that in fighting to preserve the community center, I had discovered an unexpected truth. Some things that appear to be endings, like a stroke or retirement, or being dismissed as irrelevant, can actually be beginnings, if we have the courage to reimagine what comes next. In trying to erase me, they had instead helped me find a new voice, not just for myself, but for a community that would now remember its own power. I'd like to think this story might inspire someone else facing similar challenges. If you're watching this and feeling invisible or powerless because of your age, remember, your experience isn't a liability, it's your greatest strength, and you're never too old to stand up for what matters.